Judge William Carter stepped out of his black sit-in and adjusted his robe. The morning sun was bright, but the air felt heavy, as if something unseen was pressing down on the courthouse steps. He took a deep breath and looked up at the tall building in front of him. The Jefferson County Courthouse stood with its grand white columns, a symbol of justice and law. But today, something felt different. There was a strange stillness in the air, something that made William's steps slow just a little. As he moved forward, two uniformed officers stepped into his path. Officer Bradley and Sergeant Owens stood firm, their expressions unreadable. Their posture was not of respect, not of duty. It was something else. William stopped a few feet away from them, his sharp eyes scanning their faces. He had seen many things in his years as a judge, cases of betrayal, corruption, greed. He had heard the cries of the innocent and the lies of the guilty. But this moment, this was something he never expected. "Good morning," William said, keeping his voice calm. Sergeant Owens, the taller of the two, didn't reply immediately. He only stared at William with a slight smirk, as if waiting for something. Then, in a slow, deliberate voice, he spoke. "You can't go in today, Judge Carter." The words were simple, but their meaning was heavy. William's brow furrowed slightly. "Excuse me." Bradley looked away, shifting uncomfortably, but Owens stood firm. "You heard me," Owens said. "You are not allowed to enter." William took a step closer, his robe moving gently in the breeze. The quiet murmur of the morning street had faded. It was as if the world had paused, waiting to see what would happen next. The judge let a short silence hang between them before he spoke again. "This is my courtroom." His voice was steady, each word carrying the weight of his years in law. "You are officers of the law. What you're doing right now is unlawful." Owens let out a small, amused breath, tilting his head slightly. "Orders from above." William's eyes didn't move from his face. "Whose orders?" Owens didn't answer. Bradley shifted again, his hands tightening slightly at his sides. His eyes flickered to William's, then quickly away. William exhaled slowly. He had known this day would come in some form, but he had hoped he was wrong. Hoped that times had changed. The courthouse doors stood just beyond these two men. A few more steps, and he would be inside, sitting where he belonged. But these men who had sworn to serve and protect, were now acting as gatekeepers to something bigger than just a courtroom. William's mind moved quickly. He could turn around, call someone, make this into a legal matter. But that wasn't the point. The point was right here, right now. This moment was not about law. It was about power. The street around them was starting to wake up. A few people had stopped to watch. Some whispered, others held their breath. Among them was James Holloway, a young black lawyer who had worked under William as an intern years ago. He had seen James grow into a fine attorney, one who believed in justice with the same fire William once had in his youth. Now James stood frozen, watching the scene with wide eyes. He had seen unfairness in the system before, but this was something different. A few feet away, Eleanor Baker, a seasoned journalist with a sharp eye for injustice, quietly raised her camera. Click. The moment was now captured. William's voice didn't waver. "You know this is wrong." Owens didn't reply. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, his tone dropping just enough that only William could hear. "You don't belong here today." William's jaw tightened. He had heard these words before, as a child, when he had tried to sit at a whites-only counter with his father. As a young law student, when he had applied for clerkships and been overlooked. As a lawyer, when he had walked into rooms where his presence was questioned before his words were even spoken. And now, as a judge, standing outside his own courtroom, hearing the same message in different words. But this time, he wasn't moving. William pulled out his phone, his fingers steady as he dialed a number. The call rang once before a calm, sharp voice answered. "Attorney General's office. This is Michael Thompson speaking." "Michael, it's William. I'm being blocked from entering my own courtroom." There was a pause on the other end, but not hesitation. Michael was a man who understood power plays, and he understood what this moment meant. His voice, when he spoke again, was clear and sharp. "Hold your ground. Help is on the way." William lowered the phone. Owens was watching him carefully now, sensing that something had shifted. "I suggest you step aside," William said, his voice carrying over the quiet crowd. Owens' smirk faded just slightly. "Or what?" William took another step forward. But he wasn't afraid. "You think I don't know my rights. You think I don't know the law better than you." His voice was even, but the strength in it was unmistakable. "If I don't walk through those doors in the next 5 minutes, this entire street will be filled with people demanding answers." Bradley swallowed hard. He could feel the shift happening. More people were pulling out their phones, recording. Eleanor's camera clicked again. James took a cautious step forward, his hands clenched at his sides. Then came a loud voice from the courthouse steps. "Let him through." All heads turned. A federal marshal now stood at the entrance, his badge gleaming in the morning sun. His presence alone carried weight. This was no longer just a courthouse issue. Bradley looked at Owens, waiting for a decision. Owens hesitated, his fingers twitching at his belt. Then, with a slow exhale, he stepped aside. Bradley followed. William adjusted his robe and walked forward without looking back. As he passed, he could feel the heat of Owens' stare burning into his back. This wasn't over. But for today, he had won. William Carter walked up the courthouse steps, his robe flowing behind him. His face remained calm, but his mind was racing. The moment outside with those officers was not new to him. He had seen this kind of resistance before, not just in the courtroom, but in life itself. He entered the building, the sound of his footsteps echoing in the grand hallway. The walls were lined with portraits of past judges, all of them wearing the same serious expression. But there was something else they all had in common. Not one face looked like his. William had spent his life pushing against barriers like the one he had faced this morning. He had fought for his place, step by step, inch by inch. And even now, after all these years, he was still fighting. His mind drifted back to his childhood. He had grown up in Mississippi, in a small town where the rules were different for people like him. His father, Samuel Carter, was a teacher, a good man who believed in education, in knowledge, in justice. But the world did not always respect a man like him. William remembered the day his father took him into town for the first time. He was 7 years old, wearing his best Sunday clothes. His mother had combed his hair neatly, and he had held his father's hand as they walked into a small diner. He had never been inside before. He had only ever watched from outside, staring through the window at the people eating pancakes and drinking coffee. That day, he had been excited. That excitement did not last. The moment they stepped inside, the room went silent. People turned to look at them. Some with surprise, some with annoyance, and some with something colder. A man behind the counter folded his arms. "We don't serve your kind here." William didn't understand at first. He looked up at his father, confused. His father's face was calm, but his grip on William's hand tightened. "We'll just take it to go," his father said politely. The man behind the counter didn't move. "I said, we don't serve your kind." William felt his stomach drop. It wasn't about sitting down. It wasn't about food. It was about something much bigger. His father stood tall, meeting the man's eyes for a long moment. Then, without a word, he turned and led William back outside. That was the day William learned how the world saw him. His father had kneeled down beside him, brushing his hands over William's small shoulders. "You listen to me, son," he had said. "They can stop us from eating in there. They can stop us from sitting at their tables. But they can't stop us from learning. They can't stop us from knowing the law. And one day, they won't be able to stop us from making the law." Those words had stayed with him. Through every moment of struggle, through every door that was closed in his face, through every time he was told he did not belong, he remembered. Years later, when he applied for college, the counselor had smiled politely, but had not hidden the doubt in her eyes. "Law school is difficult," she had said. "Are you sure you wouldn't be more comfortable in another field?" She had meant it. William had simply smiled and said, "I'll manage." And he did. Through long nights of studying, through working twice as hard for half the recognition, through being the only black student in most of his classes, he managed. He graduated at the top of his class. He became a lawyer, then a judge. And yet, after all those years, after everything he had earned, he still had to prove himself, even now. Standing in the hallway of the courthouse, he took a deep breath and let the memories fade. He could not afford to dwell on the past, not today. Today, he had work to do. As he walked toward his courtroom, he saw James Holloway waiting for him. The young lawyer looked tense, his hands in his pockets, his expression serious. "Are you okay, sir?" James asked. William gave him a small nod. "I've had worse days." James hesitated, then said, "I saw what happened outside." His voice was low, careful. That was expected. William finished for him. James frowned. "That doesn't make it right." "No, it doesn't," William agreed. "But this isn't new." He looked at James, seeing the frustration in his young eyes. "Do you know what my father told me when I was your age?" James shook his head. William gave him a faint smile. "He told me that justice doesn't happen in a straight line. Sometimes we move forward. Sometimes we're pushed back. But the fight never stops." James was silent for a moment. Then, finally, he nodded. William placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "Let's go inside." They entered the courtroom together. As William took his seat at the bench, he noticed Sergeant Owen standing near the back of the room, watching him. The officer's face was unreadable, but his presence alone spoke volumes. William met his gaze, unshaken. No matter how many times they tried to push him back, no matter how many roadblocks they placed in his way, he would keep moving forward. Because this was not just about him. It was about everyone who came after him. And he would not stop. The gavel struck wood, and the courtroom fell silent. Judge William Carter sat tall in his chair, his expression calm but firm. The air in the room was thick with tension. He could feel it pressing against his skin like a heavy weight. He had been in this position before, facing quiet resistance, unspoken battles, and the kind of conflict that was never written in law books, but existed between every line. Today was one of those days. The case before him was simple on paper. A land dispute between a wealthy businessman and a small black-owned company. The facts were clear. The law was clear. But the moment William looked across the courtroom, he knew this was not about facts or law. It was about power. The businessman, Henry Whitmore, sat confidently at his table, his lawyer whispering something in his ear. His suit was expensive, his posture relaxed, as if he already knew how this would end. He barely glanced at the other side of the room, where Robert Greene, the owner of the small company, sat with his attorney. Robert's face was lined with worry. He was an honest man, a man who had built his company from nothing. He had followed the law, paid his dues, done everything right. But now, because a man with more money wanted what he had, he was here, fighting for something that should never have been questioned in the first place. William had seen this story play out many times before. The businessman with power, the man without it. The assumption that the outcome had already been decided before the case even began. William gripped the gavel tighter. Not today. The opening arguments began. Henry's lawyer, a man named Douglas Kent, stood and spoke with the confidence of someone who had won cases like this before. He used big words, legal jargon meant to make simple things sound complicated. He painted Robert as someone who didn't follow proper procedures, who didn't have the right documents, who had made a mistake. When he finished, he sat down with a smug look, as if the case had already been closed. Then it was Robert's lawyer's turn. Martha Ellis was young but sharp. She stood with quiet determination, her voice steady as she laid out the truth. Robert had done everything legally. The business belonged to him. The only reason he was here was because Henry Whitmore wanted him gone. William listened carefully. He watched the jury. Some of them were paying attention, but others had already made up their minds. He could see it in their eyes. It wasn't just about this case. It was about him. About the fact that he was sitting on that bench, making the decisions. About the fact that a black man held the gavel in a courtroom where, for years, men like him had felt this silent resistance before. It was never loud, never open. It was in the way people looked at him, the way some lawyers spoke to him with just a little too much familiarity, as if they didn't believe he deserved the respect his position demanded. And it was in the way cases like this came before him again and again. Cases where the law was clear, but somehow it was always questioned when the person on the losing end had the wrong skin color. He took a slow breath. This was not a war fought with guns or fists. It was fought in small moments, in tiny decisions. A paper misplaced, a signature doubted, a loophole used, a silent war. And today, he was in the middle of it. The arguments ended, and it was time for him to speak. William leaned forward, his voice measured. "I have reviewed all the documents," he said. His gaze moved across the courtroom, landing on Henry Whitmore. "And I see no legal reason why Mr. Green should lose his property." A flicker of something crossed Henry's face. Surprise, annoyance, anger. Douglas Kent shifted in his seat, clearing his throat. "Your Honor, if I may." William held up a hand, stopping him. "There is no need for further discussion," he said, his voice calm but firm. "The law is clear. The ruling stands in favor of Mr. Green." A beat of silence. Then Robert Green let out a breath, relief washing over his face. Martha Ellis smiled, shaking his hand. But on the other side of the room, Henry Whitmore's expression darkened. He turned slightly to Sergeant Owens, who had been standing at the back of the courtroom, watching everything with cold eyes. William noticed the exchange. He knew what it meant. This was not over. The fight was never over. As the courtroom emptied, William gathered his papers, his mind already turning. He had made the right decision, the legal decision. But in a world where power often ignored the law, doing the right thing did not always come without consequences. James Holloway approached his bench, his expression tense. "That was the right call," James said. "It was the only call," William replied. James hesitated. Then, in a lower voice, he said, "You know they're going to push back, right?" William met his gaze. "They always do." James nodded, but his eyes were filled with worry. William understood. He had seen what happened to judges who refused to bow to power. He had seen what happened to men who challenged the system, who refused to accept the unspoken rules. His father had always told him, "If you do what is right, be prepared to stand alone." But William was not alone. Not today. Not anymore. He walked out of the courtroom, stepping into the afternoon light. The world outside was the same, but something inside him felt heavier. He had won this battle. But the war, that was just beginning. The night was cold, but William Carter barely noticed. He sat in his study, staring at the case files spread across his desk. The courtroom had been silent hours ago, but the echoes of that day still played in his mind. Outside his window, the city lights flickered, casting long shadows across the room. The world moved on, as if nothing had happened. But William knew better. Something had changed. The case of Robert Green had been won, but it had left a crack in the foundation of power, one that men like Henry Whitmore did not ignore. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. When he opened it, James Holloway stood there, his face tight with concern. "We need to talk," James said, stepping inside quickly. William closed the door behind him. "What happened?" James hesitated for a moment, then handed him a folded newspaper. "They're coming for you." William unfolded the paper. His name was printed in bold letters. The article questioned his fairness as a judge, subtly suggesting that his rulings favored people of his own race. The words were written carefully, not openly hateful, but the message was clear. They wanted him out. William let out a slow breath. He had been expecting something like this. Still, seeing it in print made it real. "They're trying to discredit me," he said quietly. James nodded. "And that's just the start." William set the paper down and met James's eyes. "What else?" James shifted uncomfortably. "I heard a few officers talking outside the courthouse. They think you embarrassed them by standing your ground. Sergeant Owens isn't happy. And Whitmore." He paused. "Whitmore has connections. He's not going to forget what happened in that courtroom." William nodded, his expression unreadable. He had spent years preparing for moments like this. He knew what it meant to challenge the system, to refuse to step aside. But knowing and living it were two different things. James sighed. "You could take a break, you." William smiled faintly. "Lay low." James ran a hand through his hair, frustrated. "Look, I know you're strong. I know you don't back down. But I don't want to see them tear you apart." William leaned back in his chair. His father's words echoed in his mind. "If you do what is right, be prepared to stand alone." He looked at James. "I appreciate your concern, but I won't run." James sighed again, but didn't argue. Instead, he said, "Then we fight." William studied him. James was young, full of fire, ready to take on the world. He reminded William of himself years ago. A small smile tugged at William's lips. "Then we fight." The next morning, the courthouse was different. There was an energy in the air, something unseen, but felt. William noticed the stares as he walked inside. Some were supportive. Others were filled with quiet anger. Sergeant Owens was waiting near the entrance. "Judge Carter," he said, his voice even. "Sergeant Owens," William replied. There was a pause. Then Owens smiled, a cold, slow smile. "Looks like people are starting to ask questions about you." William met his gaze, unshaken. "People have been asking questions about me my entire life, Sergeant. I'm still here." Owens's smile faded. "Enjoy your day, Judge." William walked past him without another word. Inside the courtroom, James was already waiting. He had papers spread out in front of him, his eyes scanning them quickly. "Did you hear?" James asked. William sat down. "About the complaints?" "Yes." James nodded. "They're trying to push for a review of your past cases. If they can make it seem like you're biased, they'll have an excuse to remove you." William didn't flinch. "Let them look. They won't find anything." James shook his head. "That's not the point. The point is to make people believe something is wrong. It doesn't matter if it's true." William understood. Truth had never been the enemy's strongest weapon. Doubt was. "Then we stay ahead of them," William said. James straightened. "How?" William picked up a pen and tapped it lightly against his desk. "We show them what justice really looks like." That afternoon, a new case came before William. A young man named Daniel Brooks stood in front of him, his hands clenched at his sides. He had been arrested for theft, accused of stealing from a store. The store owner, a middle-aged man in a sharp suit, sat with his lawyer. The case was familiar, too familiar. William read through the evidence carefully. The store had no cameras, no witnesses, just the word of the owner against Daniels. The prosecutor spoke first, painting Daniel as a troubled young man. He used words like dangerous and reckless. When Daniel's lawyer spoke, his words were quieter, careful. He argued that there was no proof, that Daniel had no history of theft. William listened. He watched the jury. Some of them had already decided. He could see it in their eyes. They didn't need proof. They just needed a reason. William's grip on the gavel tightened. This was the fight. Not just in the big moments, not just in headlines, but in these small, quiet battles, cases that might not make the news, but would decide the course of a young man's life. He looked at Daniel. The boy was scared but trying not to show it. William knew that feeling. When the arguments ended, he took a deep breath. He spoke clearly, firmly. "The evidence does not support the charges against Mr. Brooks," he said. "Case dismissed." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Daniel let out a shaky breath. His mother, sitting in the back, wiped tears from her eyes. The store owner looked furious, but William didn't care. Justice had been served. As he stood to leave, he caught Sergeant Owens watching him from the doorway. The war wasn't over. But today, he had won. The sound of footsteps echoed in the long, empty hallway. William Carter walked with steady steps, his face calm, his hands at his sides. The courthouse was quieter than usual, but something in the air felt different, tense, waiting. He had spent years in this building, handling cases, giving verdicts, facing resistance. But today felt different. As he turned the corner, he saw James Holloway standing near his office door, his arms crossed. His expression was tight, his eyes filled with urgency. "Something happened," James said as soon as William reached him. William didn't pause. He unlocked his office door, stepped inside, and James followed. The moment the door closed, James placed a file on the desk. "Read this." William opened the file. His eyes moved over the words, absorbing them quickly. Then he stopped. His fingers tightened on the pages. It was worse than he had expected. False accusations, twisted facts. "They're calling for a full review of your cases," James said. "They want to prove you're not fit to be a judge." William exhaled slowly. He had known this was coming. Ever since he ruled in favor of Robert Greene, the pressure had been building. Henry Whitmore, Sergeant Owens, and others like them. They weren't going to sit back and do nothing. "They're moving fast," James continued. "They got reporters writing against you. They're questioning every decision you've made in the past 10 years. William set the file down. His heartbeat remained steady, but deep inside, he felt the weight of what was happening. "This isn't about justice," William said. "It's about control." James nodded. "And they're scared because you won't play by their rules." William leaned back in his chair. He had fought too hard to reach this position, too hard to build his name, too hard to earn his seat in the courtroom. He wasn't going to let them take it away. The next morning, the attack became public. Newspapers carried bold headlines. "Judge William Carter under investigation for bias. Unfair rulings. A closer look at the man behind the gavel." On the radio, talk show hosts debated his decisions. Some defended him, but others painted him as a troublemaker, a man who had stepped too far, who had made questionable rulings. William watched the news from his office. He wasn't surprised. They weren't interested in truth. They were interested in destroying his reputation. James burst into the office, his phone in hand. "They're filing an official complaint against you. If the panel agrees, they could suspend you." William's jaw tightened. A suspension would mean stepping away from the courtroom. If they succeeded in removing him, it would send a clear message. Men like him did not belong in power. "They're trying to bury me," William said quietly. James hesitated. Then he placed a second file on the desk. "This might be our way out," he said. William opened it. Inside were documents, letters, financial records. His eyes narrowed. "What is this?" he asked. James's voice was low. "Proof. Whitmore and Owens. They've been using the system for years. Illegal deals, bribes, false charges against people who stood in their way." William flipped through the pages. The evidence was damning. "They've been untouchable for too long," James said. "But if we expose this, they'll fight back harder," William finished. James nodded. but we'll have the truth on our side." William stared at the papers. This was the moment. He could step back, let them push him out quietly, or he could fight back, not just for himself, but for everyone who had been silenced by men like Whitmore and Owens. His decision was clear. "We take this public," William said. James's eyes lit up. "Are you sure?" William nodded. "They wanted a war. Let's give them one." That night, William stood before a room filled with reporters. Camera flashes lit up the room. The air buzzed with tension. Everyone knew something big was about to happen. William held up the file. His voice was steady. "There has been an attempt to remove me from my position, not because I have broken the law, but because I refuse to bow to those who abuse it." He paused, letting the words sink in. The people behind these attacks, Henry Whitmore, Sergeant Owens, and others, have used their power not for justice, but for their own gain. Murmurs ran through the room. William placed the file on the podium. "This is the proof." Gasps filled the air. Reporters scribbled notes. Cameras zoomed in. "I will not step down," William said. "I will not be silent, and I will not allow those who corrupt justice to remain hidden." Then he stepped back. The battle had begun, and this time he wasn't just defending himself. He was fighting for the truth. The streets were quiet, but William Carter knew that silence did not mean peace. He sat in his office, the dim glow of his desk lamp casting shadows across the walls. The past few days had been a storm. His press conference, the evidence against Whitmore and Owens, the public's reaction. The truth was out, and now the city held its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. A folder lay open before him, filled with letters, some of them threats, warnings to step down before it was too late. Others were words of support from strangers who believed in him, who had faced the same injustice. But William knew the people he was fighting against. They would not let this go easily. A sharp knock on the door made him look up. James Holloway entered, his face tense. He closed the door behind him and leaned against it for a moment, as if catching his breath. "They made their move," James said. William straightened. "What happened?" James tossed a newspaper onto the desk. The headline read, "Judge Carter under investigation." William's eyes darkened. He picked up the paper and scanned the article. It was filled with lies, claims that he had taken bribes to favor certain cases, accusations of corruption. "This is their counterattack," James said. His voice was tight with frustration. "They want to turn the public against you." William set the paper down. He had expected something like this. But they weren't just trying to remove him anymore. They were trying to destroy him. James ran a hand through his hair. "People are confused, William. Some believe you, but others, they're starting to question." That was the plan. Not to prove him guilty, but to make people doubt. William's jaw tightened. He couldn't afford to lose the public's trust. "We fight back," he said. James hesitated. "There's more." William looked at him. James exhaled. "The police issued a warrant for your arrest." The words hit like a hammer. For the first time in his career, William Carter, the man who had dedicated his life to justice, was being treated as a criminal. He sat back in his chair, his hands resting on the arms of it, his expression unreadable. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. "They're not just trying to remove me from the courtroom," he said. "They want me gone for good." James nodded. "If you're arrested, it will be hard to fight back." A long silence stretched between them. Then James leaned forward. His voice was low. "We need to get you out of here." William frowned. "You want me to run?" "Not run," James said quickly. "But we need time. If they arrest you now, they'll control the story. If you stay free, we can keep fighting." William considered this. He had spent his life standing his ground, never backing down. But this was different. This wasn't just a battle in the courtroom. This was a war for survival. Finally, he nodded. All right. But we do it smart. James's shoulders relaxed slightly. I have a plan. The city was restless that night. Outside the courthouse, reporters stood with cameras, waiting. The news of Judge William Carter's arrest had spread like wildfire. Some people demanded justice for him. Others called him a fraud. But William was nowhere to be found. Inside a small apartment across the city, he stood near a window, watching the streets below. James paced behind him, phone in hand, making calls, talking to lawyers, gathering allies. "We're buying time," James said. "The longer you stay free, the harder it will be for them to control the narrative." William nodded but didn't speak. His mind was racing. He wasn't afraid of prison. He was afraid of what would happen if he lost this fight. Then a sudden bang at the door made them both freeze. James's phone slipped from his hand. William turned sharply. Someone was outside. Another bang. James whispered, "It's them." William's heart pounded. He could hear voices in the hallway. Police. They had found him. James moved quickly. He grabbed the documents on the table, stuffing them into a bag. "We have to go." William hesitated for just a second. Then he nodded. They moved to the back door, stepping into the alley. The cold night air hit them as they kept low, moving between the shadows. Behind them, the apartment door burst open. Shouts filled the air. "They know we're running," James whispered. William's face remained calm. "Then we don't stop." They slipped into the streets, disappearing into the night. The fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. The morning was cold, the sky covered with thick gray clouds. The streets of the city were quieter than usual, as if the world itself was holding its breath. William Carter sat by the window of a small safe house, watching the world outside. His suit was gone, replaced by a simple sweater and dark jeans. He had not been home in days. His name was still in the headlines, his face on every news channel. He was no longer just a judge. He was a symbol of justice, of defiance, of a fight that was far from over. Behind him, James Holloway sat at the small kitchen table, speaking in hushed tones into his phone. Over the past few days, James had become more than a friend. He had become William's last connection to the outside world, his strategist, his lifeline. "They're losing control," James said as he ended the call. His voice was tense but hopeful. "People are questioning the charges against you. Some are even calling for an investigation into Whitmore and Owens." William turned slightly. "And the courts?" James hesitated. William's jaw tightened. He wasn't afraid of standing trial. But this wasn't about the law anymore. This was about power. If he walked into that courtroom in handcuffs, he wouldn't be judged fairly. James sat forward. "We need a way to shift the story. We need to remind people what this fight is really about." William exhaled. He had spent years speaking through verdicts, through written words in legal documents. But now, the only way to win was to be heard. He nodded. "I'll make a statement." James's eyes lit up. "You want to do another press conference?" "Not just that," William said. "I want to speak to the people. I want them to hear me. Not through news headlines, not through rumors. From me." James grabbed his phone. "I'll set it up." That night, the city was waiting. Reporters gathered in a hidden location. Cameras were set up. Microphones were tested. Then William stepped forward. The room went silent. The cameras focused. The world was watching. William took a deep breath, then spoke. His voice was strong, steady. "They wanted me to be silent. They wanted me to disappear, but I will not hide." A pause. "I have spent my life fighting for justice, not for myself, but for those who have no voice. And now, those in power want to take that away from me." The reporters scribbled notes. The cameras zoomed in. "They call me corrupt. They say I have broken the law. But let me ask you, who benefits if I am removed? Who gains if I am silenced?" Murmurs ran through the crowd. The truth is simple. I stood in the way of men who have used power for their own gain. And now, they are using that power to destroy me. He let the words hang in the air. I am not afraid. A deep silence followed. Then the first voice spoke, one of the reporters. Judge Carter, she asked, what happens next? William met her gaze. We fight, he said. The video spread like wildfire. By morning, it was everywhere. People watched, shared, argued. Some still believed the charges, but many began to question the system itself. Why was William Carter, one of the most respected judges, being targeted? Why were Whitmore and Owens still free? The city stirred. And then something happened that no one expected. An anonymous source leaked new documents. They contained direct proof of corruption, payments, secret deals, cases manipulated by those in power. The city erupted. Protests began outside the courthouse. People demanded answers. They called for investigations, not against William Carter, but against the very men who had accused him. And just like that, the tide turned. A week later, William Carter walked back into the courtroom. This time, he was not the accused. This time, he was the witness. He sat before a panel, facing a room filled with reporters, officials, and the very people who had once tried to destroy him. The evidence speaks for itself, William said calmly. I was never the one who broke the law. But the men who tried to remove me, they did. The room was silent. Then, the chief investigator stood. We have seen enough, he said. His voice was firm. We will proceed with the arrests of Henry Whitmore, Sergeant Owens, and all those involved in this corruption. Gasps filled the room. William closed his eyes for just a moment. Justice had spoken. Months later, William Carter stood on the steps of the courthouse, looking out at the city he had fought for. James stood beside him, a proud smile on his face. You did it, James said. William exhaled. We did. The fight had been long. The cost had been high. But in the end, the truth had won. And that was all that mattered. He turned to James, a small smile on his lips. Now let's get back to work. And with that, William Carter walked back into the courtroom, not as a man on trial, but as a judge.